Hello, Anderson Smith here, and today we're going to talk about memory. Last week we talked about learning. This week we talk about memory. And there's some things you have to remember about memory. First, you don't look at memory. It's not a thing. You have to infer that it exists because of changes in behavior that you observe. Also, metaphors of memory are sometimes not quite accurate. Some people see memory as a warehouse or a tape recorder. A warehouse, something you can fill up. In fact, there used to be an idea about aging in memory, that the reason old people don't have good memories as young people is because they simply filled up their brain. No way. It's also not a good metaphor to use to tape recorder, because we don't just place into memory our experiences. In fact, memory is very complex, and actually is a lot of things about memory change over time, while a tape recorder simply reproduces what was played into it. I think a better metaphor about memory is scaffolding, because the more scaffolding you have, the more you can add to it, more places to hook on new scaffolding. And that's the way memory operates. The more memory that you have, the better your contents of memory, the more places you have to associate new things to that. And then finally, the distinction between memory as a thing or memory as an action. Probably better to think of memory as an action, remembering, the act of remembering, and then we can look at behaviors that we can then infer about memory in terms of what we remember and what we don't remember. Now, there are stages of memory. First, we have to acquire information. We take information from our environment, but we also, when we acquire new memories, we take things from the environment, but we also add things to it in terms of interpreting what that information is from an already existing memory. Then we have to maintain that information over a retention interval over time, and then later we have to use that information in the act of remembering. People that study memory call these three stages different things. Acquisition is called encoding. We encode information into our memory. We store it over time, and then later we retrieve it when we need to use it. And there can be problems with all three stages. We can have problems of encoding, we can have problems of storage, and then problems of retrieval. Now, when we do a memory experiment, this is what we do. We bring people into the laboratory, we present stimuli for them to remember, encoding, and those stimuli can be anything from words to pictures to sentences to non-words to drawings, things that we want you to later retrieve. And then there's a delay interval, or retention interval, that represents storage, where we have to maintain that information when it's no longer present in the environment. And then finally, we have to remember it. We have to retrieve it and use it correctly. So an experiment involves encoding, presenting some stimuli, storage, some delay interval between encoding and retrieval, and retrieval, the actual use of that information, the act of remembering. Now, when we remember, we typically in a memory experiment, we have two kinds of remembering, two kinds of retrieval. We can recall that information. What were the words I presented to you earlier? List the pictures that you saw of objects. Or we can have a recognition task. And recognition would be, here's a picture. Was this a picture that you saw earlier? Or here's a word. Did you see this word earlier? Obviously, recognition is much easier than recall because it involves less retrieval. When you have to recall something, you have to retrieve the object itself. When you recognize something, you're simply saying, yes, that is an item I saw earlier on the list. Now, there are two kinds of memory that I want to distinguish between now: explicit memory and implicit memory. Explicit memory is where you sometimes called declarative memory, by the way, is where you consciously act to recall or recognize. You're actually consciously aware of the fact that you are remembering. A kind of memory that people aren't usually aware about is implicit memory, where you recall or recognize an object, or picture, or something that you saw earlier, but you're not aware of doing so. This is called priming. Let's say I presented to you a list of words, and I asked you to rate the pleasantness of the words. And then much later in a series of tasks, I gave you a word completion task where you had to look at these parts of words and you had to tell me what the word, just write down the first word that comes to mind. Have you done that? Well, the first one is storage, a word you saw earlier, and then implicit, a word you saw earlier. And what we know is that if you saw those words earlier, you're more likely to put storage and implicit as the word you generated, even though you're not aware that you're actually doing a memory task. That's called priming. If you prime something with an earlier presentation, unaware of what you're doing, you're more likely to use that word in a word completion task. Implicit memory, memory where you're not quite aware of the fact that you are, in fact, remembering. Another memory task that's implicit is procedural memory, where you're remembering procedures, how to do something, but you're not really aware of what it is that you're retrieving. I can get on and ride a bicycle. I haven't ridden a bicycle since the beach last year, but I could get on and I could ride the bicycle. But if you ask me, well, what are you doing to ride the bicycle? I couldn't tell you. It's simply like a computer program that's running its course, and I can't remember what it is that I'm doing. Procedural memory, a kind of implicit memory. A task that's used in the laboratory a lot to look at procedural memory is a mirror tracing task, where you have to look in a mirror and trace the star here. That's a very difficult task. But you can't see your hand. That's covered up by a board. You only can look in the mirror while you're trying to draw a line inside of that star. What we know is that if you practice this and do it over and over and over again, you get much better at it. When you ask me, what am I doing to do at getting better, I can't tell you. It's simply I'm getting better. With practice, I can learn to do that. It's an implicit memory. I can't describe it. I can't declare what I'm doing. I'm just learning how to do it. Now, very interesting thing about this kind of implicit memory, this kind of procedural memory, is that you remember I talked about HM in one of the first lecture modules? HM was a patient that had, because of epilepsy, had a temporal lobectomy on each side, bilateral temporal lobectomy. A few people have had that operation. It cured his epilepsy, but what it did was absolutely stop him from being able to learn any new stuff. He had no declarative memory capabilities at all. We're going to talk about HM later this week. But the interesting thing is, if you put HM in a mirror tracing task, in a procedural memory task, he showed the same kind of improvement over trials that a normal person would have. Even though every time you put him in the task, he had no recollection of being in the task ever before. You had to describe what he had to do each time he tried to do it. He had no declarative memory. He had no explicit memory of the task, but he had implicit memory because he showed the same kind of improvement that is shown in normal people. What it tells us is that explicit memory and implicit memory are very different. They have to be actually housed in different parts of the brain because HM had no temporal lobes. He had no ability to have declarative memory or explicit memory, but he did have the capability to having procedural memory or implicit memory. Explicit, implicit, two very different kinds of tasks. That's it for today. We learned that there are different stages to memory: encoding, storage, and retrieval. And we learned that there's a big distinction between explicit memory, declarative memory, and non-declarative memory or implicit memory. Memory that you're aware of, declarative memory, explicit memory, and memory that we're not aware of, implicit memory. Thank you.